The German Shepherd didn't snarl. That's the part nobody could explain afterward. Opal Strickland was mid-stride between tables 11 and 12 when the hand found her wrist. Rough, impatient, the grip of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. The man at table 9 had been nursing single malt scotch for 2 hours, and whatever patience he'd walked in with had dissolved somewhere around the 4th glass. He yanked her sideways so sharply that the breadbasket tilted on her tray, and she had just enough training to catch it before it fell. Hey, his breath hit her face, warm, acidic, the particular stench of money and entitlement gone stale. I've been waiting 20 minutes. What does a man have to do around here? Opal's jaw tightened. She knew the rules: smile, apologize, de-escalate, keep the peace. She never got the chance. Ghost moved. The big German Shepherd had been lying under the corner booth by the window, his dark muzzle resting on his paws, his amber eyes half closed, the deceptive stillness of an animal that is never truly at rest. He'd been invisible to most of the dining room all evening, the way powerful things sometimes go unnoticed until they aren't. But the moment that hand closed around Opal's wrist, Ghost was on his feet. He didn't lunge, he didn't attack. He crossed the 20 feet between them in almost total silence and placed his body between Opal and the drunk man, with the careful, deliberate precision of someone who had done this calculation before and knew exactly where to stand. No growl, just a sound that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the floorboards, low, continuous, and absolute. The man's fingers went slack. The entire dining room of the Obsidian held its breath, silverware suspended over plates. A woman at table 3 stopped mid-sentence and forgot what she'd been saying. Even the jazz pianist in the corner let a chord hang in the air longer than it should have, his hands suddenly unsure of where to go next. Opal looked down at the dog. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She knew Ghost's reputation. Everyone who worked at the Obsidian knew it. The German Shepherd that Cillian Drake had pulled out of a fighting ring 3 years ago. The animal that had been trained to see the world as a series of threats to be neutralized. The other servers whispered about him, the way they whispered about his owner, with a mixture of fear and reluctant awe. She reached out slowly, half expecting to pull back a hand with fewer fingers. Ghost leaned into her palm. His eyes didn't leave the man at table 9. His body stayed angled in front of her like a wall. But when her hand found the top of his scarred head, something in his posture shifted, not softer, exactly, but different, like a soldier who'd finally received a signal they'd been waiting a long time for. Impossible. The voice came from the back of the room, and it carried the particular quality of a man who was not accustomed to being surprised. Cillian Drake was already on his feet. He moved through the restaurant the way he moved through everything, with a deliberateness that made the space around him feel different, as if the air itself was paying attention. He was tall, dark-suited, a decade and a half of controlled authority visible in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands. There was a thin scar along the ridge of his left cheekbone that he'd never explained to anyone who asked. No one who mattered had asked twice. He stopped directly in front of Opal, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, not with the appraising eye of the drunk man at table 9. Something more unsettling than that. Something that felt like being read. 3 years, he said. His voice was quiet in the way that very certain men speak quietly, not because they doubt you'll hear them, but because they know you will. That dog has been at my side for 3 years. He has never shown that kind of response to anyone, not once. Opal swallowed. I'm just the waitress, sir. No. Cillian's eyes didn't leave her face. You're not just anything. Ghost was a bait dog. You know what that means? They used him to train other animals, to make them vicious. He learned that kindness was a trap. He paused, and something moved across his expression. Brief, unguarded, gone almost before it arrived, and yet here he is. He reached down and touched Ghost's head. The dog's tail made one quiet movement, like a period at the end of a sentence. What's your name? Opal. Opal Strickland. He repeated it to himself as if testing its weight. Then, come find me before your shift ends, Opal Strickland. There's something I want to discuss. She didn't know what she was walking into. She only knew that Ghost was still standing beside her, calm and warm and oddly protective, and that her life had just changed in some fundamental way she didn't yet have the language to describe. A girl nobody noticed just caught the attention of the most dangerous man in the city. And when Cillian Drake pays attention, the world reorganizes itself around that fact. If you want to see what happens when an ordinary woman steps into an extraordinary world and refuses to lose herself in it, subscribe right now, because this story is only just beginning. The offer came at the end of her shift, at a small table near the kitchen entrance, where the sounds of the restaurant were just a murmur behind glass. Cillian slid an envelope across the table. Inside was enough money to make Opal's vision blur briefly at the edges. Behind it, a single card, Table 1, tomorrow, 7 o'clock, exclusively. What this means, he said, settling back in his chair, is that you'll serve me and my guests only. You'll be present for conversations that are not meant to leave the room. You'll hear things that could make certain people very uncomfortable. He let that settle. In exchange, your mother's hospital debt disappears. The collection calls stop, and no one in this city with any sense will bother you again. Opal stared at him. You researched me. I research everyone who interests me. I interest you because your dog liked me. For just a moment, something that might have been amusement shifted behind his eyes. Ghost doesn't like anyone. He tolerates, he endures. What he did tonight, that was something else. I've spent 3 years trying to understand what's broken in him and what's still whole. You answered that question in about 40 seconds, and I'd like to know how. She almost said no, spent the whole bus ride home turning it over, looking for the angle, the trap, the price you couldn't see on the card. By morning, she knew she would go. Not because she was afraid of what happened to people who said no to men like Cillian Drake. That was part of it, maybe a small part, but mostly because she'd grown up watching her mother work 3 jobs and smile through it, and she recognized exhaustion disguised as choice. The hospital debt was real. The collectors were real. The chance to end both of those things wasn't something you handed back just to keep your hands clean. She accepted at 7 the next evening, sitting across from him at table 1 while Ghost lay at his feet, watching her the same way he watched everything, with total attention and no judgment whatsoever. She started small. A week into the arrangement, she noticed how Ghost tracked every movement in the room, how his ears pinned back when a busser came through too fast, how he positioned himself with his back always to a wall. She recognized these things, not because she'd studied animal behavior, but because she'd spent her childhood learning to read a room the same way, knowing which exits were clear, which voices meant trouble was coming, where the safe corners were. Ghost, she kept her voice low even, the way she'd learned to keep it in her mother's hospital room when the news was bad, and she needed to hold something steady, easy. The dog's ears lifted, his eyes found her face. Not a threat. He looked back at the busser, then at her again. His hackles settled. 2 days later, he started doing it on his own, checking her face before reacting to anything that moved too quickly. It was such a small thing, and it undid something in Opal's chest every single time. It was during a quiet afternoon in Cillian's private office that she found the scars. She'd been asked to wait while he handled a call, and Ghost had come to her, his nose working the air. When she ran her hands through his coat, her fingers found the raised tissue. A burn mark the size of a thumb on his left flank, the kind of shape that couldn't have happened by accident. A shallow groove along his right shoulder. Places where fur grew wrong over old wounds, the way hair grows back over ground that's been disturbed. Someone did this to him on purpose, she said quietly, when Cillian came back. He stood in the doorway, his jacket slung over his arm. Something in his expression went very still. The men who owned him used him to condition their other animals, he said. He was chosen because even after everything, he never turned aggressive. He just kept absorbing it. His jaw worked once. When I found him, he was 3 years old and weighed 40 pounds less than he should have. He let me put a leash on him without flinching. I think by then, he'd just learned to go wherever anyone pointed him. Opal was quiet a moment. And you brought him here. I thought I was saving him by teaching him to be feared, by making him something no one would touch. Cillian crossed to where Ghost lay and crouched beside him, his scarred hands resting on his knees. But fear isn't the same as safety. I know that now. I'm not sure I understood it when it mattered. She looked at him, at the careful way he held himself, the precise distance he kept between himself and the admission he'd just made. She recognized that distance, too. She'd kept it herself, in rooms where showing too much meant losing too much. She said, "He's learning he doesn't have to brace for impact every second. That's not nothing. That's actually everything." Something moved through Cillian Drake's expression that she couldn't name, but she filed it away carefully. Fowler Swick arrived on a Tuesday with the ease of a man who believed every room was entitled to him. Silver-haired, precisely dressed, the kind of face that looked distinguished until you found his eyes, flat and measuring, the eyes of someone who had made a lifelong habit of calculating other people's value and finding them wanting. He took a seat at the bar without being invited and ordered a drink he didn't touch. He waited. Opal recognized the type before she learned his name. She'd worked in enough rooms to know this man hadn't come for the food. When Cillian appeared, Fowler let the silence stretch 3 full seconds before he spoke. "I heard you'd gone soft," he said, loudly enough for the nearest tables. "Thought it was rumor." His gaze moved to Opal with a slowness that was worse than being stared at directly. The kind of look that turns a person into a problem to be managed. "The families are asking questions," he continued, "about where your priorities are, about what has been distracting you from the things that matter." He tilted his untouched glass toward her. "A waitress, Cillian. You've built your reputation on never being predictable, and here you are." Ghost, who had been still until that moment, rose to his feet. The sound he made was low and continuous, and nothing like the warning he'd given the drunk man at table 9. This was older. This had memory in it. "He knows you," Cillian said. "He should." Fowler smiled at the dog, who did not smile back. "I was there when he was trained. Remarkable animal. Shame, a process. But that's the cost of making something useful. You have to break some of what was there before." "State your business." "My business is reminding you what happens when men in our position start protecting things they can't afford to lose." Fowler looked at Opal one last time. It was a look with an intention behind it. "She's a liability. I'm just the only one saying it to your face." He left without touching his drink. The silence after had a different weight than the silences before. "He wasn't warning you," Opal said, when the bar had cleared around them. Cillian looked at her. "He wasn't here to give advice. He was here to tell you he's already decided something." She kept her voice level, the way she kept it when she needed Ghost to understand she was certain. "People who come to warn you bring information. People who come to declare something bring theater." Cillian was quiet for a moment. Then, "Ghost has never reacted like that to anyone since I found him. Whatever those men did to him in that ring, he doesn't remember faces. He doesn't remember sounds." He looked at the dog, who had not returned to rest but remained standing, watchful, still, ready. But he remembered Fowler Swick. He drove her home himself that night, insisted. She should have let him keep doing it. 3 nights later, she took the long way home because she needed 20 minutes of air that didn't belong to anyone else's world, and Fowler Swick's people were waiting in the parking structure beneath her building. She didn't see them until it was already too late. She woke to cold concrete under her cheek, her wrists zip-tied to a metal chair, and Fowler Swick sitting across from her in an abandoned building that smelled like rust and old motor oil. Cleaning his thumbnail with a folding knife like this was simply the next item on his calendar. "You're not afraid," he said. Her wrists ached. Her head throbbed, where she'd connected with something she didn't quite remember. But she kept her breathing steady and her eyes level, because she had grown up in enough frightening situations to know that her reaction was the one thing in this room she could still control. "I've been scared before," she said. "You get used to working through it." He studied her with something that passed for curiosity, in a face that didn't have much room for it. "Cillian will come. He's predictable now. He has something to protect, and that means he can be moved." He stood and circled her chair slowly. When he walks through that door, my men will be ready, and the families will understand that Cillian Drake let sentiment make him careless. That's not a reputation you come back from. You were his mentor, Opal said. Fowler paused. He didn't tell me much about you, but enough. She held his gaze across the cold room. You taught him to survive in your world, and you're angry because he started surviving it in ways you didn't teach him. I taught him that attachment is a loaded gun pointed at your own skull. You taught him that fear was the only language worth speaking. She let a beat pass, but I've spent weeks watching a dog that was trained exactly the way you trained Cillian, trained to believe that staying hard was the only way to stay alive, and that dog is learning a different language, slowly, without any guarantee it'll work. He's doing it anyway. She met Fowler's flat eyes and didn't look away. You should see him now. He's remarkable. Fowler's expression went somewhere cold and decided. He left the room without answering. Don't go anywhere. What happens next is the moment that changes everything. Fowler Swick built his entire world on the idea that mercy is weakness. He's about to find out exactly how wrong that is. Subscribe and ring the bell so you're here for every second of it. The building's side door came off its frame just past midnight. Cillian came through first. Ghost was at his heel, low to the ground, moving with the focused quiet of an animal that has been given a purpose and knows precisely what it is. 3 of Fowler's men were waiting in the darkness, positioned with the confidence of people who believed they held the advantage. They were wrong about that in every way that mattered. Cillian moved through the room with an efficiency that had nothing theatrical about it. 2 men down before the third had fully committed to a direction. Ghost handled the third, teeth finding forearm, not throat, a restraint that Opal understood immediately was deliberate, controlled, chosen. Then Fowler appeared from the back room, and he had a gun pressed to Opal's temple before she'd fully registered he'd moved. Drop it, Fowler said, or I end the experiment here. Cillian went perfectly still. This was the trap. The man who had everything to lose, made helpless by the exact thing he'd been warned about. His reputation, all of it collapsing into one moment where caring about something was exactly the liability Fowler had promised it would be. He hadn't accounted for Opal. She looked at Ghost. The dog was frozen mid-stride, his full attention on her face rather than on the gun or the man holding it. Waiting, she could feel it with certainty, for the signal she'd been teaching him without knowing she was teaching him anything at all. Ghost, her voice was calm. It surprised her to find it so. Stay. The dog's muscles locked. He settled back half a pace, repositioning, his gaze moving around the room with something that looked very much like calculation. Fowler's grip tightened. What are you? She found Cillian's eyes across the room. He was watching her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not fear, not fury. Something more fragile than both, and more honest than either. Trust me, she said quietly, not to Fowler. Then Ghost find. It wasn't a command she'd ever given him. But Ghost had spent weeks learning the difference between the words she used when she meant easy, stand down, we're safe, and the words she used when she meant something urgent and real. He heard the urgency now as clearly as if she'd spoken his name. He didn't go for Fowler. He went around him, a long, low arc to the edge of Fowler's peripheral vision. In the same instant, Cillian moved forward. Fowler's head turned 1 centimeter toward the movement he'd sensed but couldn't locate, his grip shifting fractionally. The shot went into the concrete floor. Fowler was down a breath later, blood seeping dark between his fingers where he clutched his shoulder. Not dead, not even near it. Cillian's shot had been exactly what he'd intended it to be, enough to stop the immediate problem, and no more than that. Opal looked at that, at the precision of the restraint, and understood something. One of Cillian's people cut the zip ties from her wrists. She stood, worked the circulation back into her hands, and walked past Cillian, who still had his weapon out, trained on Fowler on the floor, and crouched down in front of the man. Opal, Cillian's voice carried a warning. She paid it no attention. She looked at Fowler Swick for a long moment. He was breathing in short, hard pulls, sweat matted in his silver hair, and his eyes were showing the first genuine thing she'd ever seen in them. Not contempt, not calculation, just the simple, animal fact of pain and the thing that lives underneath it, which is fear. "You told Cillian that caring about something is a weakness," she said. "Then you designed an entire plan around the fact that he'd walk through that door, reckless and off balance, because he cared about me." She gave that space to land. "Which is it? Because you can't have it both ways. Either caring is a weakness, and your plan was stupid from the beginning, or caring is a kind of power, and you've spent your whole life calling it by the wrong name because the right name frightened you." Fowler said nothing. I could tell Ghost to finish this. She kept her voice even, factual, not cruel. "He'd do it. Not because he's vicious, because he trusts me that completely now. That's what loyalty actually looks like. It's not domination, it's not fear. It's choosing to act for someone and meaning it." She held his gaze. "I'm not giving that command, not because I can't, because I'm choosing not to. And that difference, that choice, is the thing you never understood and never will." She stood, turned to Cillian. "He's finished," she said. "Everyone in this room knows it. Everyone who matters in your world will know it by morning. If you kill him, you give him the ending he'd have wanted, relevant enough to be worth the bullet. If you let him walk, he has to spend whatever time he has left knowing he was beaten, not by your gun, by a waitress who decided he wasn't worth the permanent damage." The room was very quiet. Cillian Drake looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she could see him working through something, turning it over, setting it down. Then he holstered his weapon. "Get him out of my city," he said, to no one in particular. "I don't want to see him again." Fowler was helped to his feet. At the door, he stopped without turning. His voice had lost all its careful warmth. "I don't understand either of you," he said. "No," Cillian said, "you don't." The door closed. Ghost pressed his head against Opal's thigh, warm and solid and entirely present. She put her hand on him, and neither of them moved for a while. Opal proved something tonight that Fowler Swick built his whole life arguing against. Mercy isn't soft. It isn't naive. It's the hardest kind of strength there is, because it requires you to choose it on purpose with full knowledge of the alternative. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me, would you have let Fowler walk, or did he deserve something different? I read every single one. 3 months passed, and the Obsidian was the same restaurant and an entirely different world. The clientele hadn't changed. The careful mix of people whose legal exposure ran roughly parallel to their net worth still occupied the same booths, still conducted the same careful conversations that required a certain deliberate deafness from anyone within earshot. The world Cillian Drake moved through hadn't gotten simpler or safer or more forgiving. It never would. But the atmosphere had shifted in ways that were difficult to quantify and impossible to miss. Opal Strickland no longer wore an apron. She sat at table 1, and no one at the Obsidian found this remarkable anymore, because the first person who'd implied it was strange had discovered fairly quickly that Cillian's attention operated in more than one temperature. She still knew every corner of the restaurant, which tables needed managing when the kitchen was running behind, which guests required the careful art of being made to feel important without being allowed to feel powerful. She'd learned it all from the floor up, and that knowledge didn't go anywhere. But she sat at the table that mattered most now, and when something needed to be navigated, a dispute, a misunderstanding, a conversation that could go 2 ways and needed to go 1, both voices from that table carried equal weight. Ghost had changed, too. He still wore his collar, the worn leather one Cillian had put on him the day he brought him home. He still carried his scars, he always would, but he moved through the restaurant differently. His tail held a different position. His ears were softer, his whole body less braced against the world, the way a person stops bracing when they finally stopped waiting for the next hit. Children who came in with visiting guests had learned they could reach out slowly, carefully, and Ghost would let them. He'd check Opal's face first, the habit of those early weeks, when she'd taught him to read her calm as permission, and then he'd be still under their small hands. He had learned, it seemed, what she'd been trying to show him. That strength doesn't require constant proof. "There's someone I want you to meet," Cillian said one evening, while the restaurant hummed low around them and Ghost dozed warm under the table. A young man came in through the side entrance, 19, maybe 20, dark-haired, moving with a slight hitch in his right side that Opal recognized immediately as a recently healed injury. He stopped at table 1 and looked at her with an expression of plain, unguarded relief. "You're her," he said. "You're the one who hid me in the stairwell and told the guys looking for me the building was empty." Opal stared at him. "This is Finn," Cillian said. "My cousin. He was jumped outside a bar 3 months ago. He made it to the nearest building with lights on, which happened to be yours." She looked at the young man, at the way he was watching her, earnest and a little undone, like she'd done something extraordinary by ordinary human instinct. "You were bleeding," she said. "What was I supposed to do?" Finn Drake laughed. It was the kind of laugh that had been held back a long time and finally had somewhere to go, bright and startling in the quiet of the room. "Pretty much what you did," he said. "I just wanted to say it to your face. Thank you, genuinely." Later, after Finn had gone and the dinner rush had settled to a low tide, Cillian said, "You didn't know who he was?" "No." "You didn't ask, didn't want anything from it?" "He was hurt and scared," Opal said simply. "That's all." Cillian was quiet a long moment, his hand resting near hers on the table, close enough to be a choice, careful enough not to be a demand. He was learning that too, she'd noticed. The difference between the two. "I told you at the beginning," he said, "that Ghost trusted exactly one person, that I needed to understand why he chose you." He looked at her directly, nothing measured or careful in it this time, just the honest face of a man who'd arrived somewhere he didn't expect to arrive and was deciding whether to say so. "I think I finally do." "Tell me." "You don't see what something was. You only ever look at what it could become." He held her gaze. "I've spent 15 years making sure people only saw what I was, what I am. You walked in here and looked straight past all of it, and I didn't know what to do with that for a long time." Ghost stirred under the table. He laid his head across Opal's foot, warm, still, completely at ease. Across the obsidian, the work that Cillian Drake's world required continued its careful dance. It always would. None of that had changed. None of it would. But something had been built inside of it that hadn't been there before. Not innocence. She was too far past that, and so was he, but something that was trying, honestly, and without applause, and with no guarantee it would hold. Trying to be better than what it started as. That choice, made quietly, daily, in a world that respected nothing but power, she had come to understand that it was the hardest thing either of them did, and it was completely theirs. She looked down at Ghost, his weight steady against her ankle, and thought about a dog trained to fight who chose, in one unscripted moment in a crowded restaurant, to protect instead. No one told him to. No one asked. Some choices, she had learned, contain the whole story. Before we close tonight, I need to know what you think. Leave it in the comments because I read every single one. When Ghost chose Opal in that very first moment, before she'd done a single thing to earn it, what did he know that everyone else in that room missed? Is it true that animals sense something in people that we can't name? Tell me, and if you stayed all the way to this last line, thank you. That means more than you know. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and I'll see you in the next one.